All right, well, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker, Molly. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Molly Rideout is a writer, bookmaker, and grant specialist who coaches artists of all disciplines on marketing, proposal writing, and artist statements through her work at MassMocha's Assets for Artists program, which serves creatives in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut with business and financial professional development programming. She joined Assets for Artists in 2019, and prior to that, she was the executive director of Grin City Collective Artists and Writers Residency in Grinnell, Iowa. Shout out to Iowa, that's where I'm from too. In her creative practice, Molly is the current Edith Wharton Writer in Residence at the Mount. Her fiction and nonfiction chapbook, Transient, was published in 2019 by Antenna Paper Machine, and her micro-story, Public Art, is installed across Wisconsin, Iowa, and Ohio. She now makes her home in North Adams, Massachusetts. Molly, thank you so much. I'll let you take it from here, and I know Susanna has some great questions lined up for you to dive in further after your presentation. Oh, I also wanted to say Molly has generously agreed to share her slides with us, so you don't have to frantically take notes or screenshots. We will email those to you post-event. Thanks, Molly.
Of course. Well, thank you all for coming to spend your weekend or your evening, at on such a dense and stressful topic, but you're here and we're gonna, find ways to get y'all money. So I'm gonna dive right in, and as Jody said, there's you're gonna get all the slides, and so there's gonna be some slides that have a bunch of text on them that we're just gonna blow through. Don't stress out about that, because I wanted to just put as much information as would be useful to you after the fact too. So just a warning and not to panic. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen here and we'll get started. And I will say I have I dry out my throat very quickly, so I'll be pausing and taking a lot of drinks, and I apologize for that. So basics for grant writing. Some of this is gonna perhaps be just a little too basic for you, but I wanted to make sure everyone's on the same page for those who don't have any experience for grants whatsoever. So there's kind of two different kinds of grants out there among the arts. One is grants for individuals, which of course is ones that you would be looking out for. But there's also a much broader pool of grants that are only available to nonprofits. You might find a grant and say oh, this sounds great, and then see, oh, it's only open to organizations that are nonprofits. And that's because of a variety of complex tax things with America. But some of the things that we're going to talk about is how you can still find ways to access those grants, even if you're just an individual doing your own project. So among the different opportunities for individuals, there are, of course, direct calls for artists or writers to apply. That could be something from, say, RISCA or the National Endowment for the Arts if you're going really big, right? There's a fellowship that would be, $20,000 from the NEA, and that could be something that's open only, to individuals. And then there's also project grants, which, as the name implies, are for specific projects. They're not just for you existing as a writer. And one of the difficulties that we deal with here in America is that we are in a capitalist-based country that really cares about the product of things much more than supporting the arts as the arts, right? So there's very few fellowships out there and many more project grants because we live in a country that focuses on product. So another kind that you can be looking for is direct calls for people to apply to grants that aren't specifically for artists and writers, right? Maybe your project overlaps with other categories of work. Maybe you're doing work on, women's history or on environmental justice. And so with each project, think beyond the idea of just, I can only apply to something that's for writers or something that's for artists. Think about all these other intersections that your project might have, because then that opens the field for you. Less common, right, are personal grants from individuals being like, hey, I want to give you $500. That's great. And, you know, it's becoming more popular with crowdfunding. And, you know, we like to imagine like the old Italian patrons of the arts, right? That's less popular these days, but those are still other types of grants that can exist. And then something, as I hinted to more, partnerships with nonprofits. And what that would entail would, you know, on like a nuts and bolts level, the nonprofit is going to hire you to do a project, which sounds like really boring, but it's not. If you say, hey, I have a project that I would love to do with you, here's what it is. And then they say, oh, that sounds great. Let's find the money to make that happen. And once you get a partnership with a nonprofit, they are able to pay a contractor, which is you, to do work for them, which is your art. And then they can suddenly apply for all of these grants that are only open to nonprofits, or they can ask their donors who, you know, want that tax write-off for giving to a nonprofit. And suddenly you have access to all of these possible funding streams that you as an individual wouldn't have. So one of the things that I really like to encourage folks to do is to really think outside the box of what are the different ways that I can create a partnership or think outside of my genre to find that money. The reality, of course, is that there's this huge pile of things that you want to make, and then there's this like big category of what the funder wants to pay for, and it's usually a pretty small sliver that overlaps, but it's that small sliver that you have to identify and focus in on when you are applying for a grant, because of course they only want to pay for what they want to pay for. And so if you end up talking about all these things that they don't want to pay for, then they won't be as inclined to fund you, right? But the goal would be, if you get enough slivers, right? This is my like super unofficial trying to draw on my computer. If you get enough funders giving you those little pieces together, you'll be able to hopefully fund enough of the project to make it actually happen, right? So it becomes a puzzle, of course, and that can be really frustrating, but as you keep doing it, you'll get better at it and thinking about, okay, this funder really likes to focus in on this funder really likes to focus in on this, and if I put those two things together, I'll get enough money to do the whole project. So what do grants pay for? What grants are out there, right? What do funders want to pay for? This is a question that if you don't dig in can feel a little anxiety producing. And again, these are the limitations of our American society right now, is funders don't care about you just making your art. They want to know about who is your art affecting? Who is the audience that you are serving? And what change are you providing them? And this can be really hard for writers because, you know, it's not something really clear like, I'm going to do a dance performance and there will be 60 people there. And so I know that I will have served 60 people, right? And so this is something that takes a little bit of kind of mind shifting, and sometimes takes the form of, okay, I have my writing and then there's going to be this additional thing that I will do that will get me the money to allow me to do the writing. And so one of the things that is really important for you to think about, because I promise you almost every grant is going to ask you for this if it's a project grant, is who is the audience of this project? Who are you serving? And you know, if you're working a soup kitchen, it's pretty easy to say, here's the neighborhood I'm serving, here are the type of people that are coming in, but how do you do that for a book? You know, when I was younger and you know, starting out writing, I would think like, I'm just going to write what I want to write, and then I'm going to put it out in the world and see who picks it up. And that that is how so many of us kind of start and start creating. But when it comes to the grant, we have to like create an imagined audience of who we're going to be targeting. And there might be like overlapping audiences, right? It might be like people who love sci-fi and also young adults and also like people who live in Providence, right? And those all, you know, for a sci-fi books, for YA set in Providence, those might be overlapping audiences. And so thinking about, okay, how can I talk about these different audiences and the ways that my work is going to speak to them. And so then maybe you can find a grant that focuses on serving young adults, or a grant that focuses on Providence, or a grant that just really loves sci-fi. And so then suddenly you have more options too. But they will ask you, who is your audience? So be thinking about that. Because so many project grants are audience focused, there are certain things that funders are more likely to pay for. And with the performing arts, it's like so much easier because a performance is inherently something that delivers to an audience and that funders will pay for. And so as a writer, we kind of have to shift to thinking, how are we going to have that direct impact to our audience? And so some of the things that come to mind for me is a reading series, or giving a poetry class, right? You're serving these students, or the cost of printing out books that you're going to give out. That's a direct, you know, audience interaction. And those might not be things, you know, that's not like writing your piece, but presumably at some point you're going to want to get your piece out in the world. And so thinking about how that last stage will happen can kind of help you when you're thinking about a grant of, okay, this is the stage that gets me to the audience. I want you to help pay for that stage, and then maybe a little bit of the writing too. And so thinking about what are those like deliverables, to use like jargony grant terms, that you can provide the public. I think, sorry, I like rearranged my slides. Okay, so then the types of funding, you know, we talked about how there's like fellowships and there's project grants, right? So how do you think about a project? What is a project? When I started this out, I would be really stressed of thinking like, okay, a project is something new that I have to come up with that's in addition to the work I'm already doing. And so like, I'm doing the stuff that I want to do, and then I have to come up with some new thing. And then that's going to be double work because I'm going to keep doing this thing I want to do. And then it was like really groundbreaking to me to realize like, oh wait, as a writer, everything I do is a project, right? I create a short story, that's a project. Create a book, that's a project. And really all a project is something that you can define has a start and an end date and has a clear outcome. And that outcome can be tangible, like a book or a short story, but it can also be intangible, like the research process for a book. You know, you say, all right, I start the research here, I end the research here, and when I'm done, I'll have this whole chunk of research. That's still a project. And so when we think of a project, I at least always think huge. You know, I think like a book project, right? Which is going to take like 2 to 3 years, all my time, and no one's going to fund me working full time for 3 years. And so the next step is to think, okay, this is my vision. How can I break it up into individual chunks, into these individual projects, so that instead of finding someone to pay for creating this entire book, they're instead paying to have me create one essay for it, or one short story for it, or a few poems for it. And that then becomes like a financially manageable size for a grantor to be able to give out. But if you stack enough of them up, you got your whole project. And then there's, of course, like operational funds too, which are, to be frank, the thing that no one's going to pay you for. And those are things like the cost of your, like the room in your house that is your writing space, or the cost of utilities, or when your computer breaks down, buying a new computer, or all of your printer paper for all of your drafts. No one's going to pay you for that unless there's like a few very, very special writing fellowships that will cover those things. But the trick is to include like a small sliver of that into all of your project grants. And this is something that organizations do when they're applying for grants, that businesses do when they're applying to the government for grants, because, you know, you've got the security team and the custodial team and the people who do all the bookkeeping. And those aren't sexy. No one's going to pay for a grant just for your bookkeeper. But that expense exists. And so there's this kind of understanding that you can add to your total project grant, something like 10 to 15%. I would keep it more at 10, but you can bump it up to 15 a little, to just start like cutting into some of those operational costs that you have. And again, I know I'm going through this like really fast, but remember that the slides will still be here for you afterward. So I'm going to give you an example of like a big project and how I personally then like broke it down into a small fundable project. So Jody mentioned that right now I'm the writer in residence at Edith Wharton's The Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts. And even before that, I have had this project that I've been working on, which is a collection of essays that are inspired by different small towns across the US that I've spent time in and really like dug into the history of. And so the Mount reached out to me and was like, we'd love to have you submit a proposal to be our writer in residence. And I thought, that's awesome, but I need to make sure that I'm submitting a proposal that's going to match what I want to do and what they want to do, right? So that they're just as excited as I am. So before all of that, I was thinking, what are the different types of places that I could fund for this collection of short essays about small towns? And so here were some of the things that I thought of. Like, of course, people that want to fund writers, excellent. Small towns, I was digging into history, so maybe there's local history museums or small town arts councils, or small foundations that are connected to very specific towns that I'm working with. They might have funding and are interested in someone who is looking at their community with an artistic lens, right? Humanities councils are another option. I think Jody or Jillian mentioned that REACH has a COVID grant out right now. The Rhode Island, is it REACH? Is that how it's something like that?
Yeah, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities just opened up a grant that's due April 1st. So we'll get a link in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. So humanities councils, as a writer, you kind of balance on both the like arts council and the humanities council. You can kind of have a foot in each door. And so here were some other things that I thought of. Libraries are like our best friend because they inherently care about what we do. And they are a entity that can apply for grants. And so if you find that there's a partnership that you want to do with them, approach them and say, hey, I want to do this. I want to do a reading. I want to like do a class for kids. I don't know, whatever works with your practice. So here was the proposal that I put together for the Mount, which was that I was going to research and write one essay that interwove personal memoir in the history of Lenox from specifically the time when Edith Wharton was there. So I was getting the thing that I cared about, small town, which Lenox is where the Mount is. I was making it very specific to this Edith Wharton piece, right? Lenox has been around for 300 years. I was going to focus in on like the 10 years she was there. And then that audience piece, I am also a bookmaker. And so I was going to hand make a book of maybe 100 copies and give those to the Mount. Well, I mean, they're going to pay me to make them, right? So then they have these 100 copies that they can do with as they will. And so that was the project that they ended up funding. And again, it's just like one small piece of what my larger project is, right? But it will hopefully, like, I'll be able to keep finding these small pieces and get my larger project paid for. This was another example that I thought we could potentially brainstorm on, but for the sake of us kind of hurrying through, we can come back to this later if we have time, of what would be the different ways you could fund an environmental dystopian sci-fi novel. All right, project budget, the like really stressful part. And again, you're gonna get all these slides. So a budget should include both all of your expenses and all of the income for the project. And even if you have zero income planned, that's okay. You're applying for the grant, and so that grant will be your income. You're also, I bet you, donating a whole lot of your time to this project that someone's not paying you for. And so you can count that as income too, because it's a donation from yourself. Something that is really important for you and also like for all of us to make sure that you include is every single expense in your budget, including your like paying yourself a fair wage for your time. Even if that's not actually going to be cash that you receive, mark it as this is an actual cost of the budget. I like to think of it as like, what if I were a heartless corporation and I was like billing this to another heartless corporation? What would I be asking them to pay for? Because those are all real costs. We tell ourselves that they aren't real costs because like we love doing it. Forget that. Charge that money. And always remember that projects are going to take at least 50% longer than you think they're going to. So if you're like, oh yeah, this will be like a 40-hour short story to write, 60 at least. And in-kind support is something that's like my best friend, especially in the art world. In-kind support equals donations. And that doesn't just mean like someone gave me their computer. It means like someone is spending time doing something for me for free, or I'm doing this thing for free. And so when it comes to that income, you're like, I don't have any income, but I'm putting in 80 hours of free labor into this. Those 80 hours of free labor is an in-kind support contribution that you're giving to your project. Here are a bunch of different things that like I brainstorm of being important to make sure that you remember to include in your budget. I won't go through them all right now because you'll have the list later, but think about what things are not on this list that are specific to your practice. I'm sure that there's many. And then here's just a very quick and simple budget. I have my expenses up top. I'm going to spend 85 hours working on writing this thing or making this book. And then I need the supplies for making 100 books. And then I'm going to add 10% of those costs to it. And then you see down at the bottom, I say, okay, the amount's going to pay me $3,000. That still doesn't add up to everything in the expenses. So I'll say that I'm donating $900 worth of my time. Like in actuality, like I'm super happy to be getting, 3,000 minus the 1,000 of supplies for my time, right? It might not be everything that if I were going to work every day and clocking my hours that I would get, but like I'm okay with that. I'm okay with donating that time. So these are some things we've already covered of what are some different ways that you can think outside of the box beyond like the traditional arts grants. And then I have here, and I know that What Years also put together a list of some of the kind of more larger opportunities. There's also national ones. Creative Capital has a deadline. They extended it. It was going to be Monday, but because of all the power outages in Texas, they extended their deadline to, I believe, the 8th, whatever day of the week that is, maybe next Monday. That's a very large grant, $50,000 plus $50,000 in-kind support that they give you. It's definitely something for you to check out. They also are very particular about the kinds of projects that they're interested in. And also because it's such a good grant, everybody and their mother applies for it. So probably none of us will ever get it, but that doesn't mean we should never try. NALAC, I know, also has a COVID-19 grant that just opened up. So if you identify as Latinx, you should check that one out. So that was my very fast, rapid summary of like quick overviews of the basics of grants. So as in addition to being a writer, this kind of grant support work I do through MassMoCA's Assets for Artists program. And as Jody mentioned, we do a lot of work in Rhode Island. And so we have a specific page on our website that we update whenever there's new stuff that we're doing with Rhode Island. So bookmark that page and check it every now and then. or add yourself to our email list, which you can find on our website, and then you'll be the first to know when we've got new things for Rhode Island too. And I think that's it for the me talking straight part. So I'll stop sharing so we can all see each other.
Thanks for all that straight talking, Molly. That was wonderful. And just thanks for expanding our imaginations around the way we can fit our creative practice into a grant proposal and budget. So Susanna is now going to join the conversation and has some questions to open this up, and then we will open it up to the audience. So keep those questions in mind. We'll ask you for them in the chat in just a moment. Susanna, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I echo Jody. Thank you so much, Molly. This is really helpful, and so helpful to have such a writing specific approach too, because it is really difficult to find a grant as a writer sometimes.
Yeah.
So I know that, we have a variety of people who are members at the club, from people starting out to those who have gotten many grants. But for the writers who are here who haven't applied for a grant before because, you're just holed up in your attic writing your book and you're not thinking you can get money to fund it.
Right.
It's a ton of work to put together an application, especially the first one. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions on balancing out how much work a grant is going to be to sort of get in motion, compared to how much it's going to actually support you and what just the process of writing the grant can potentially do for a project, and getting your name out there. So, when's the right time to start applying for a grant, and what's worth applying for when you're starting out?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's a balancing act, and it's going to be, like submitting your work to journals, it's going to be a hell of a lot of rejections before you get some acceptances. And yeah, so in terms of that balancing act, I think looking at the grant and getting a sense of, first and foremost, like who has received it in the past, and seeing, okay, is this the type of person, the type of writer, the type of artist who is kind of on par with me at my like level of development. There honestly are a lot of grants that kind of have like hidden criteria that they don't tell you about, right? Like this is really aimed towards mid-career folks, or this is really aimed towards emerging folks. And while they won't say that, you can get a sense of that through looking at who's received it in the past. Like maybe they tend toward, a particular kind of genre that they don't maybe even realize that they tend toward, right? That they're biased toward. So really looking at that and seeing, okay, does this match with me? And also remembering, like, these grants are probably not going to go anywhere. And so if this isn't your year for it, you're like not quite there yet, put it in a file somewhere and come back to it in 5 years or 2 years and say, okay, am I there now? And so just because it doesn't fit for you now, don't despair. And then in terms of like, I find that it's certainly like the smaller grants are going to be easier to get, and especially like more local, like more geographically local, the smaller the population. Like Creative Capital is open to everyone in the country, and no one's going to get that on their first try. Creative Capital actually literally says you have to apply more than once before your stuff will even be considered. And so, but if it's like a particular neighborhood that has an opportunity, you're going to be like 1,000 times, if not 1,000,000 times more likely to get that. And you probably have some connections that you can like talk to someone and say, hey, is this project the right match? And even if you don't have those connections, reach out to the organization and say, hey, this is who I am. This is the thing that I'm applying with. Does it feel like a good fit? I'd love feedback. The worst they can do is just not reply, right? But the best they can do is give you insight that you wouldn't have known if you were just applying cold.
That is awesome advice. Yeah. I'm thinking about, we have writers in a number of genres. We've got a lot of science fiction and fantasy writers. We've also got middle grade and romance thriller writers. Like, if a writer is working in a particular genre, would you suggest applying for these kinds of grants differently than literary fiction writers? Like, especially I'm thinking of maybe the bigger grants. I feel like you've given us kind of a roadmap into finding some community connections, but are like, what does a genre world look like in the grant world?
Yeah, I mean, the reality that everyone who works in genre knows is there are biases against genre in the literary world, right? And that sucks. And so I think that it is possible that if you're applying to something that's like just for writers and is just a fellowship, say, that your work might not be considered on the same level as someone who's doing what's arbitrarily called literary fiction, right? But, and this is like a huge but, that's where all of these other like tools that I was talking about of all these different access points to funding can be really useful. Like young adult or middle grade or children's writers, they've got an advantage on one level because like everybody wants to fund helping kids, right? And so there's suddenly like all this education leveled stuff that is that you could potentially have access to. If you're working in sci-fi, chances are you're dealing with some like real serious like social struggles that we have in our society, right? Be they environmental, be they like social, whatever those like themes are that you feel yourself emerging with, like that can be your access point of saying, this is what I'm writing, this is why it's important in the world, and you care about this sector, you care about environmental justice, you care about gender equality, and then suddenly you have access through that. If you are a writer who writes work that you see mostly for just for people to have fun reading, those can be a little harder to convince a grantor to fund because, again, they're caring about audience impact. But I suspect that all of you who think you just write because you want someone to have fun reading your work are really actually grappling with like societal issues and questions that you can really access these additional sources of funding. And it's just, you know, we're writers, so spin it. Talk about the way in which your romance novel is really, you know, breaking down gender norms or whatever it is. And I think that would be super refreshing to see in grants more often.
Suzanne, are you back with us?
I am back, and sorry.
That's an awesome response. You ready to go?
Yeah, I was going to just circle back and ask you about some of the budget stuff. Specifically, like, how do we go about writing down how much to pay ourselves as writers? Do you have any suggestions for budgeting our writing and research time, or kind of working that in? And are there any red flags that, you know, like if a budget comes in with this amount for the writer time, funders are going to be like, whoa, that's, you know, that's not thought through, or just, you know, but also that we're paying ourselves, and the time that we spend on our work is valued, and we're putting that back into the system too as something to value.
Yeah, I think that last part is the ways in which budgets can be kind of like their own, I don't know, bit of social justice of saying this is what this work is worth. And so I suspect that every one of you, whatever like dollar number you would put on what your time is worth, you're worth more than that. And So first off, I want to say that I often tell people, just like you should multiply your time by 50% at least, you should probably multiply what you're considering your hourly by 50%, or by 150% if you're multiplying. And that's, so in the contract world, like, you know, in the like business world, we have people who are salaried, right? And they get paid, you know, whatever a year to do work. And then occasionally a business will bring in a contractor who like just is doing a specific project, and you're a contractor. And it is pretty standard for, and even, you know, in the folklore world, which is like has some overlap with the writing world, a best practice that is taught to folklorists is, when you are working with a organization, find out who like is kind of comparably educated to you, or like, and I mean education just like in your practice, not like credentials. Find out how much they make and then double it. And that's how much you should be asking for. Because there's this acknowledgement that contractors, you know, we're having to pay self-employment tax. We're having to buy our own computers and have our own offices and whatnot. And so it's probably going to feel like way more money than you're worth. But if you ask for that money, then the next person who comes is more likely to be able to get that money too. And so all of us are kind of like harming each other by undervaluing ourselves. I'll give like a brief example. So in our organization, we were working with this group of 3 artists, and we're asking them to design a special artist residency for us that we couldn't do on our own. And we were like, how much will it cost for you to design this and pull this off? And we, in our heads, were like, it's going like $5,000. And they came back to us and said, it'll be $75,000 for the 3 of us to appropriately do this project. And here's why: it's going to take this amount of time. We're independent contractors. And like, we were all blown away at that number, but then we understood the rationale and we realized that it was a lot more work than we thought it was going to be. And we went back to the funder we were working with and they said, okay. And that was really empowering to me to watch that process. And so I want to empower all of you to do similar things. And then, so you asked a question of like red flags. I think a red flag on a budget would be if you have, let's say all of your expenses add up to $20,000 and your income line says, I am asking for this grant for $2,000 and I don't have any idea where the rest of the money is going to come from. That's a red flag, because I, as a funder, would look at that and say, this project's not going to happen because they need way more than we're able to give them. So that's where kind of being upfront with what your in-kind costs can be is where it's good. Like, obviously ask for as much as they will give you, but then making sure that you kind of are able to figure out where the rest of that money is going to come from. That would be a red flag for me.
I love that answer, especially about paying ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna wrap up our conversation part so that we can get to all the questions too, to just transition over from the red flag and ask you as a grant reviewer, what do you wish was done more in grants? What would you like to see more from in applications from writers specifically?
I would just love to see more writers applying for grants, period. Especially for arts grants. Like, remember, you're an artist, and if something says it's for artists, that's you. Like, unless it specifically says visual artists only, apply for it. I am always seeing visual artists severely outweighed by writers in the grants that I'm reviewing. So just like you have a system for applying for journals, whatever that system is, set that up for grants.
All right, thank you so much, both Susanna and Molly. And to everyone else, we're opening it up to your questions now, so you can go ahead and use the chat